He could face a courtroom, his mother's silence, the ghost of who he'd been. But 4 small words, those he buried under fireworks, schemes, and one devoted disaster of an elf. Love, it turns out, can't be staged. We begin our story now. The ring had been in his pocket for 11 days. Draco Malfoy knew the exact number because he counted it each morning, the way other men counted debts, while he dressed before the long mirror in the bedroom that had, against every prediction his bloodline had bred into him, become theirs. Hermione's books on his side of the shelf, her hair ribbon abandoned on his washstand, the faint particular scent of her, ink and bergamot and something warmer underneath, soaked now into the very linen of his life. 11 days the little velvet box had ridden against his hip like a stone swallowed and not yet passed. And 11 evenings he had carried it home and brought it back out again, untouched, the latch never sprung. Tonight, he had decided, would be the night. He had decided this on 6 previous nights as well. The dining room of the small house they let in the Wizarding Quarter near Hogsmeade was not grand. He had been raised in grandeur and had learned, slowly and at great cost, to mistrust it. This room was low-ceilinged and honest, the table a slab of scarred oak that had belonged to somebody's grandmother, and the candles upon it were ordinary tallow that guttered and wept down their own sides. He had lit them himself with a match because she liked the smell of struck sulphur, and because the small labour of it gave his hands something to do that was not trembling. He watched her eat. He was very good at watching her without seeming to. It was a skill he had perfected over years, first in the suspicion of school corridors, and later in the disbelieving wonder of being permitted at last to simply look. She was telling him something about the ministry, about a brief she had argued that afternoon before the Wizengamot, her fork lifting and falling, her voice quick and certain in the way that had once made him want to throttle her, and now made him want only to keep her talking until the candles burned to nothing. Now, he told himself, say it now, before she finishes the sentence, before you lose the thread of your own nerve. His thumb found the box through the wool of his trousers. The velvet had gone smooth at one corner from so much handling. And Robards had the audacity to suggest the precedent didn't apply, when it plainly does, when any first year who'd read the statute could see it does. And I told him so, more or less in those words. And Draco, you are not listening to a syllable I'm saying. I am, he said. His voice came out lower than he intended, scraped thin. Robards, the precedent. You were magnificent. You are always magnificent. Hermione set down her fork. The candlelight moved over her face, and her eyes, brown, unhurried, devastating in their attention, settled on him with a particular weight that meant she had noticed something. She noticed everything. It was among the reasons he loved her, and very much the reason this was impossible. You've gone strange, she said. You've been strange all week. You keep starting sentences and abandoning them. The box. His hand on the box. All he had to do was draw it out, was sink to one knee on the worn boards, was assemble into a single sentence the truth that had lived in him for longer than he could decently admit. That he wanted to belong to her in the oldest and plainest way there was. That he wanted her name spoken beside his for the rest of a life he had once been certain he did not deserve to keep. The words were there. They had been there for 11 days. They crowded his throat now like a flock startled into too small a doorway, and not one of them would go through. Because if he asked, she could answer. That was the whole of it. The thing he had not confessed even to himself until it sat across the table from him wearing her face. A Malfoy was raised to ask for nothing he was not already certain of receiving. To request was to expose the want. To expose the want was to hand another person the power to deny it. He had spent the first 17 years of his life learning that lesson, and the years since unlearning nearly everything else. But that had stayed, lodged deep, a splinter grown over with skin. He could face a great many things. He had faced a courtroom and his mother's silence, and the long mirror that showed him each morning the boy he had been. He was not certain he could face her saying no. "I'm only tired," he said. The lie tasted of ash. She did not believe it. He watched her not believe it, watched the small downward turn at the corner of her mouth that meant she had filed the untruth away to be examined later. But she let it lie there between them because she was kinder than he had ever earned, and she picked her fork back up. "You'd tell me," she said, not quite a question, "if something were wrong." Nothing is wrong. This, at least, was true. Nothing was wrong. Everything was, in fact, so unbearably right that he could not work out how to lay claim to it. They finished the meal. He cleared the plates with his wand because his hands wanted occupation, and the water in the basins sang and steamed, and outside the window the autumn dark came down over Hogsmeade with the first thin needles of rain. He could hear it begin against the glass, a soft, irregular tapping, the sound the world makes when it is trying to get your attention and you are too occupied with your own cowardice to answer. She came to stand beside him at the basin. She did not speak. She leaned her shoulder against his arm. Just that, just the warm fact of her weight, and he stood very still under it, the way a man stands still when a wild thing has chosen, inexplicably, to trust him. Her hair smelled of rain already, though she had not been out in it. She always smelled faintly of weather, of the outdoors, of things that could not be kept behind walls. He turned his head and pressed his mouth to the crown of her head, once, and felt rather than heard the small contented sound she made. "Ask her. She is here. She is leaning on you. There will never be a moment more ready than this one." His free hand drifted to his pocket, the box. His fingers closed on it. "Hermione," he said. And then, because the universe had a sense of humour sharpened specifically against him, the kettle she had set to boil before dinner, and which they had both forgotten, reached its crisis and shrieked. The sound tore through the small kitchen like a hex. Hermione startled upright, laughing, already moving toward the stove, already reaching for the dishcloth, the moment broken into pieces too small to gather, and Draco stood with his hand around a velvet box in his pocket, and the name of the woman he loved dying unspoken on his tongue for the 7th consecutive night. He let go of the box. Later, when she had gone up to bed, when the house had settled into its nighttime creaks, and the rain had thickened to a steady drumming against the slates, Draco sat alone at the scarred oak table and took the box out and opened it at last. The ring caught what little light there was, a thing of pale gold and a single stone, the cool grey-green of her eyes in certain weathers, chosen after 3 weeks of agonized deliberation in a jeweller's on a Parisian backstreet, because he could not bear for it to be diamond, could not bear for it to be the sort of cold, flawless thing his family had always prized. He had wanted it to look like her, warm, particular, worth more than its accounting. He turned it in his fingers. The silver signet on his own hand caught against the box's velvet with a small dry rasp, and he was aware, suddenly, and with the clarity that comes only late at night, of the absurdity of his position. He was Draco Malfoy. He had stood before the Wizengamot and given testimony that had cost him the last shreds of his family's standing. He had walked into the ministry every morning for 3 years through the silence of people who would never forgive him and did not have to. He had built, out of the wreckage of who he had been, something almost like a man. And that man could not, would not, manage 4 words to the only person in the world he wanted to say them to. He shut the box. The latch clicked, small and final. It was then, in the particular despair of that click, that the thought arrived. It arrived unbidden and unwelcome, the way the worst ideas always do, dressed in the borrowed clothes of reason. He could not do this alone. He had proven that 7 times over. The flaw was not in the wanting. The wanting was the truest thing in him. The flaw was in the doing, in the staging, in the unbearable, solitary weight of the moment. And what a moment wanted, perhaps, was not one cowardly man and a box, but a plan, an occasion, something arranged, something witnessed, something grand enough and certain enough that his nerve would have no room left to fail in, something help could build. And there was, he realized, precisely one person in the world who possessed both the devotion to assist him and the discretion to keep it from her. Well, 2 people, if one counted Potter. And Draco Malfoy would sooner have counted the cost of his own teeth than count Potter. But the elf adored Potter, trailed after him like a small frantic shadow, and would do nothing without the man's knowledge. And so the one would have to mean the other. The thought of asking Potter for anything sat in his chest like a swallowed coal. He looked at the box in his hand for a long moment, there in the candlelight, with the rain coming down over the roof of the house that had somehow become his home. Then, with the grim resolve of a man walking willingly toward his own humiliation, he reached for a quill and a clean sheet of parchment, smoothed it flat against the old wood, and began, crossing out the first line twice, to compose the most degrading letter he had ever written in his life. The leaky cauldron at 4:30 in the afternoon was nearly empty, which was precisely why Draco had named the hour. He sat in the furthest corner, his back to the wall in the old reflex he had never quite shed, a cup of tea cooling untouched before him, because his stomach had closed itself against the prospect of the next half hour. He had arrived 20 minutes early. He had read the letter he carried. Potter's terse reply, 4 words. Fine. 4:30. Why? Perhaps 40 times, searching it for mockery and finding, infuriatingly, only mild curiosity. The door swung, admitting a gust of wet October air and the smell of the street, and Harry Potter came in shaking rain from his coat like a dog. He spotted Draco at once. Of course he did. The man had spent his adolescence learning to find Draco across crowded rooms, and old habits, Draco supposed, ran in both directions. Harry dropped into the seat opposite without ceremony. He looked older than the boy Draco carried in memory. There was grey threading the hair at his temples now, absurd on a man not yet 30. And the green eyes behind the spectacles had acquired the steadiness of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything. He regarded Draco with the patient wariness of a man who suspects he is about to be asked for money. Malfoy. Potter. A silence followed, broad and uncomfortable as a moor. Tom the barman clattered something behind the counter. The rain ticked against the leaded windows in their diamond panes. Draco's signet ring rasped once against the ceramic handle of his cup, and he stilled his hand. "You wrote to me," Harry prompted, when it became clear Draco intended to die before speaking first. "You asked me here. I'm here. So," he spread his hands, "whatever it is, just say it. I've got aura paperwork that would make a grown man weep waiting on my desk, and I find I'd genuinely rather be doing that. So." The words Draco had rehearsed, measured, dignified, designed to give away as little as possible, abandoned him entirely. What came out instead, in a voice he did not recognize as his own, low and fast and roughened with something that was not quite fear, was the truth. "I want to ask Granger to marry me, and I can't manage it." Whatever Harry had been braced for, it had plainly not been that. His eyebrows climbed toward his dishevelled hairline. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. For one excruciating moment, Draco was certain the man was going to laugh, and braced for it, jaws setting, the old armor sliding up over the soft and undefended thing he had just exposed. But Harry did not laugh. Something moved across his face instead, something complicated, and when he spoke, his voice had dropped to match Draco's own. "You can't manage it. I have tried 7 times. Now that the dam had cracked, the rest came pouring through it, and Draco could no more have stopped the flow than stopped the rain. 7. I have the ring. I have had the ring for a fortnight. I have, Merlin help me, I have rehearsed, and every time the moment comes, I find I would rather apparate into the center of the Atlantic than open my mouth. And so I say something idiotic about being tired, and the moment passes, and I hate myself with a thoroughness I did not previously know I was capable of." His knuckles had gone white around the cup. He made himself loosen them. "I cannot do it alone. I have proven that. I need—" The word lodged like a fishbone. He forced it out. "I need help." Harry sat back. He took off his spectacles, polished them on the hem of his jumper in a gesture that struck Draco as maddeningly unhurried, and set them back on his nose, and looked at Draco through them with an expression that had shed all of its wariness and held instead a dawning, unwelcome warmth. "You came to me," Harry said slowly, as though tasting the strangeness of it. "Of all the people in the world, you came to me. Believe me, Potter, the irony has not been lost on me. I have lost sleep over it. Why not Theo Knott? Or Blaze? Zabini? Whatever he's calling himself now. You actually like those people. Because they would mock me until the end of recorded time," Draco said, with the flat candor of a man past the point of dignity. "And because they have all the romantic instincts of a pair of garden slugs. And because I find, to my considerable disgust, that I trust you not to make a public spectacle of my humiliation. You have," he added, the words like swallowing glass, a certain reputation for decency. It is your single most irritating quality." A grin broke across Harry's face, sudden and genuine, transforming it. "That might be the nicest thing you've ever said to me. Do not become accustomed to it." But the thing had shifted, somehow, in the saying of it. The moor of silence had drained away, and something else had come up in its place. Something neither of them had a name for. Two men who had spent half their lives as each other's certainties, leaning now toward the same small table over the same impossible problem. Harry pulled his chair closer. He wrapped both hands around the tea Tom had brought without being asked, and his brow furrowed in a way Draco recognized, distantly, as the look the man wore when he had decided to throw the whole of himself at something. "All right," Harry said. "All right, Hermione." He said her name with the easy fondness of long friendship, and Draco felt the old useless jealousy flicker and die. He had made his peace, mostly with all the years of her these people held that he never would. She wouldn't want anything flashy. She'd hate flashy. She'd want... I know what she would want. Draco's voice came sharper than he meant it. "Do you imagine I don't know her? I know the way she takes her tea, and the 3 words that make her cry in every book she's read 100 times, and the precise sound she makes when she has won an argument she expected to lose. I know her, Potter. The knowing is not the problem. The asking is the problem. I require a structure, an occasion sufficiently fixed that my nerve cannot wriggle out of it, something arranged. So you want me to help you plan it? I want you to help me survive it." Harry nodded slowly, and there was a glint in his eye now that ought, in hindsight, to have served as a warning, the particular brightness of a man who has just been handed a problem he finds delightful and intends to enjoy. "I can do that. I can absolutely do that. We could do something at the place you first... No, where did you first..." He stopped. "Actually, how did you two even... The whole of Wizarding Britain has been wondering for 3 years, and nobody's had the nerve to ask." "And nobody will," said Draco coldly. "Least of all you." "Fair." Harry held up a peaceable hand, but he was still smiling. The wretch. "Right. We'll need ideas. Proper ideas. We should make a list." He was already patting his pockets for parchment with the doomed enthusiasm of a man who had no idea what he was about to unleash. "We should..." He never finished the sentence. There was a sound, a small, sharp crack of displaced air, the unmistakable report of house elf apparition, which by every law and ward should not have been possible inside the leaky cauldron. And then, materializing in the narrow space between their table and the next, with the abruptness of a cork from a bottle, there stood Dobby. He had aged in his own elfish way. The great green eyes were the same, vast and luminous and brimming already with feeling. But he wore now an extraordinary ensemble of mismatched garments that proclaimed his freedom to the world. A child's striped jumper, 3 odd socks layered up one arm, a tea cosy upon his head at a rakish angle. He had survived the war by the breadth of a hair and the speed of Harry's hands, and in the years since he had become a fixture of the wizarding world's odder corners, a free elf grown bold to the point of recklessness. And he was, at this moment, vibrating with an excitement so intense it seemed likely to lift him bodily off the floorboards. "Dobby is sorry," he announced, in a voice pitched to carry to the rafters, while both men lunged simultaneously to hush him. Dobby did not mean to listen. Oh no, Dobby was only bringing Harry Potter his. But Dobby could not help the hearing, sirs, because Dobby's ears is very large and the words is very loud, and oh, the enormous eyes swung to Draco and filled instantly and entirely with tears. The good Master Draco, the Master Draco who has changed, who Dobby has watched change, who is not at all the cruel boy from the bad old house. The good Master Draco wishes to marry. "Keep your voice down," Draco hissed, with the strangled urgency of a man whose darkest secret is being broadcast across a public house. But it was useless, entirely useless, because Dobby had already seized one of Draco's hands in both of his small leathery ones and was pressing it to his own narrow chest as though to keep his heart from bursting clean out of it. "Dobby will help," the elf wept, with the radiant certainty of a creature who has found, at last, the purpose his whole being was made for. "Dobby will help the good Master Draco make the most beautiful proposal that the world has ever seen. Oh, Master Draco, it will be magnificent. Dobby has so many ideas. Dobby has hundreds of ideas. Dobby will not rest. Dobby will not sleep. Dobby will not eat his toast until the lovely Miss Hermione Granger, who freed Dobby's friends and is kind to all elves, and gave Dobby a book once, sir, a book of her very own, until she has said yes." Over the elf's tea-cozied head, Draco's eyes met Harry's. In Harry's face, he saw the precise reflection of his own dawning horror, the slow shared comprehension of two men who understood, with the awful clarity of hindsight, arriving a fraction of a second too late, that whatever they had set in motion had just acquired a third member who could not be uninvited, who operated on an entirely separate plane of reality from either of them, and whose love was as boundless and as catastrophic as a flood. Harry's mouth twitched. He pressed his lips together. He was, Draco realized with a fresh surge of loathing, fighting not to laugh. "Well," Harry managed, in a voice gone thin and strangled with the effort of containment, while Dobby below them wept on with joy, and began already to enumerate his ideas in a breathless, rising torrent that involved, in its opening movement alone, the words fireworks and the entire sky and singing. "I suppose that settles the question of whether you'll have help." Draco looked down at the small ecstatic creature clutching his hand, then at the man across the table biting the inside of his cheek bloody, then at the cold tea, the rain on the diamond panes, the whole irreversible architecture of the disaster he had, with his own quill and his own cowardice, summoned into being. He closed his eyes briefly and accepted with the resignation of the truly doomed that he had just made the gravest tactical error of a life not short on them. The plan, when it was finally settled, belonged to Dobby in spirit and to no rational mind in execution. They had argued it through across 3 furtive meetings, once more at the Leaky, once in a hired room above an apothecary that smelled perpetually of dried newt, and once, disastrously, in Harry's own kitchen at Grimmauld Place, where Dobby had become so overcome with the romance of it all that he had set the curtains alight twice and had to be persuaded down from the dresser. Draco had wanted something contained, something quiet. He had proposed, with what he considered admirable reason, a simple letter slipped beneath her morning tea. But Dobby had wept at the smallness of it, had called it unworthy of the lovely Miss Granger, had clasped his hands and conjured for them in feverish detail a vision so vast and so luminous that even Harry, who ought to have known better, had been carried along on the tide of it. The vision was this, that on the coming Saturday evening, when Hermione walked home from the ministry through Diagon Alley as she did each week to visit Flourish and Blots before it shut, the sky itself would open above her. Dobby's magic, older than wands, stranger, bound by no law the ministry had ever thought to write, would paint across the dusk in living fire a message of such beauty that she would stop in the cobbled street and look up and understand, in a single overwhelming instant, the whole of what Draco had failed for a fortnight to say. And there, beneath the burning words, Draco would be waiting. "It is too much," Draco had said, for the 11th time on the eve of the thing. "It is grotesque. She will be mortified. She loathes a public spectacle nearly as much as I do." "It will be beautiful," Dobby had insisted, eyes shining, and Harry had clapped Draco on the shoulder in a manner that suggested the matter was decided whether Draco liked it or not. And Draco, who had run out of the will to fight and had never possessed the will to disappoint the elf, had let himself be swept along because it was easier than the alternative, and because some traitorous part of him wanted, badly, to believe that grandeur might do what his own coward's tongue could not. He understood his error roughly 4 seconds after it began. He was stationed, as instructed, in the mouth of the alley beside the cauldron shop, where the cobbles ran damp and silver under the gas lamps, and the evening had come down in that particular violet hush that Diagon Alley wore at closing time. He had dressed with care. The box was in his breast pocket over his heart, where he could feel it knock against his ribs with every breath. Down the lane he could see her, could see Hermione in her grey work robes with her satchel over one shoulder and her hair coming loose from its pins as it always did by the day's end, walking unhurried toward the bookshop, entirely unaware. His mouth had gone dry. His heart was performing something frantic and arrhythmic. "Now," he thought, "now the sky will open, and it will be beautiful after all, and I will only have to walk forward and be there when she looks down." High above the rooftops, Dobby, perched invisible upon the chimney of Gringotts, where he had insisted the vantage was finest, raised his small hands and loosed the magic he had spent 3 days preparing. It began correctly. That was, in the end, the cruelest part. For one suspended instant, it was exactly as promised. The dusk above Diagon Alley ignited. Letters of golden fire unfurled themselves across the darkening sky, vast and flowing and impossibly graceful, and the first word bloomed perfect and whole. Hermione, in script so lovely it might have been written by an angel's own hand, and Draco's heart leapt into his throat, and below in the street people had begun to stop and point and gasp, and he thought, "Merlin, he's done it. The mad creature has actually done it." And then the magic, which had no governor but Dobby's own overflowing heart, and which had been fed by 3 days of an emotion too large for the vessel that held it, did what such things always do when they are loved too hard and reigned too little. It surged. The golden letters swelled. They brightened past beauty into glare, past glare into a heat that Draco felt against his upturned face from 100 feet below. The graceful script began to run, the way ink runs in rain, the careful loops of Hermione sagging and dripping molten light down the sky, and the second word, which was to have been will, the beginning of "Will you marry me?" emerged not as letters at all, but as a great formless gout of fire that bloomed outward like a struck match touched to oil. The crowd's gasps changed register entirely. Somewhere a woman screamed, not in wonder. The sagging E of Hermione detached itself from the rest, drifted earthward, and set fire to the awning of the apothecary, which went up with a whoomph and a smell of burning herbs that would hang over the alley for a week. "No," Draco said, to no one, very quietly. "No, no, no." It got worse with a speed that defied belief. Dobby, seeing his masterpiece deforming, did the worst possible thing a panicking creature of boundless power can do. He tried to help. He flung more magic at it, frantic to fix the loops, to redraw the letters, to salvage the beauty. And the sky, already overfull, ruptured. What had been a message became a conflagration. Fireworks that no one had planned burst spontaneously out of the molten ruin, screaming Catherine wheels of gold and green, and a particularly virulent puce, raining sparks down over the shrieking crowd, and the great drooping remnant of Hermione collapsed entirely into a rolling ball of flame that took the shape, for one horrible, unmistakable, indelible instant, witnessed by some 200 Saturday shoppers, of an enormous, grimacing, fire-wrought skull, jaw agape, achingly reminiscent of a mark that the wizarding world had spent years trying to forget. The screaming became general. Draco stood frozen in the mouth of the alley, his face lit orange by the burning sky, the box knocking against his ribs, and watched 200 people flee in panic from a proposal. He saw a man trip over a fleeing child. He saw the apothecary's awning collapse in a shower of embers. He saw a squad of off-duty auras materialize from nowhere with wands drawn. And he saw, and this was the moment his soul left his body, he saw Harry Potter sprint into the center of the chaos, waving his arms and bellowing, "It's fine. It's a controlled display. It's a controlled display. Everyone, please." In a voice that fooled absolutely no one, while above him the sky skull belched one final spectacular firework from its open mouth, and then, mercifully, began to gutter and die. And Hermione. Draco's eyes found her through the smoke and the running figures. She had not fled. Of course she had not fled. She was Hermione Granger, and her instinct in any catastrophe was to run toward it. She stood in the middle of the emptying street with her wand already out, her satchel dropped at her feet, calmly extinguishing the burning awning with a hard silver jet from her wand tip, while she scanned the chaos for anyone hurt. Competent, furious, magnificent, entirely in command. And as the smoke thinned, she turned, and her gaze swept the alley, and it landed, for one terrible instant, directly upon him. Upon Draco Malfoy, standing alone and motionless in the mouth of the alley beside the cauldron shop, dressed in his finest robes, with no possible business being there, his face a picture of stricken guilt, visible across 40 feet of smoke. He saw the question form in her eyes. He saw the gears of that formidable mind begin to turn. Why is he here, dressed like that, standing there? Why does he look like that? And he understood that he had perhaps 3 seconds before the smartest witch of her generation assembled the catastrophe into its true and humiliating shape. He did the only thing his shattered nerve permitted. He turned and walked, very fast and with as much dignity as a fleeing man can muster, in the opposite direction, around the corner of the cauldron shop and into the dark of the side lane, and pressed his back to the cold, wet brick and stood there with his heart slamming and the smell of burnt herbs in his throat and the box still knocking against his ribs. A small crack sounded beside him. Dobby had appeared, and the elf was a portrait of devastation, the tea cosy gone, the great eyes streaming, his small body trembling with the force of a grief that seemed likely to unmake him. "Dobby is sorry," he whispered, and his voice had lost all its earlier glory. It was tiny now and broken, and it cut Draco worse than the disaster had. "Dobby is so sorry, Master Draco. Dobby loved it too much. Dobby always loves it too much. Dobby will iron his hands. Dobby will—" "You will do nothing of the kind." The words came out of Draco harder than he intended, and the elf flinched. And Draco, who had been raised in a house where elves were punished as a matter of breakfast routine, Draco, who had spent years now trying to scrub that house out of himself, crouched down at once in the filthy lane in his ruined fine robes and took the small shaking creature by the shoulders. "Listen to me. Listen. You will not harm yourself. Not for this. Not for anything. Do you understand me? It was not your fault. It was mine, for asking the impossible of a heart as large as yours and expecting it to keep to my small, mean lines." He drew a breath that shook. "It was a magnificent skull, Dobby. Truly. 200 people will have nightmares of it. We will count that as a kind of success." A wet, hiccuping sound escaped the elf, half sob, half astonished laugh. Draco felt his own mouth twitch despite everything, despite the sirens of aura whistles now rising behind them, despite the absolute and unsalvageable ruin of his first attempt. And then a third crack, and Harry, soot-blackened and wild-eyed, stumbling into the lane having apparently just talked an entire aura squad out of arresting anybody, took one look at the two of them crouched together in the filth and opened his mouth to speak. But before he could get a single word out, a voice rang down the side lane from its far end, clear, sharp, unmistakable, and rising with every syllable toward a pitch of dangerous comprehension. Calling, "Draco, Draco Malfoy, I know you're down here. I saw you. You come out this instant and tell me what in the name of Merlin is going." And the three of them, man and elf, went absolutely rigid in the dark as her footsteps came on toward them over the wet cobbles. 3 of them vanished in the space of a single heartbeat. Harry with a soft pop, Dobby with a guiltier one, leaving Draco alone against the brick with the wet cold of it seeping through the back of his ruined robes and her footsteps drawing on. And the cowardice that had governed his life rose up in him one final time and made the decision his pride could not. He pushed off the wall and walked away from her voice, fast, around the next corner and the next, and disapparated from a doorway with her name still ringing in the lane behind him, and hated himself the whole way home. She did not come back that night. She owled instead, a single line, the handwriting pressed hard enough to tear the parchment in one place. "We will discuss this when you have decided to be honest with me." He read it 40 times. He did not sleep. He lay in the bed that smelled of her with the box on the nightstand beside him, and stared at the ceiling and listened to the rain, and understood that the disaster had cost him more than dignity. It had put a thing between them that had not been there before, a small cold draught of distance, and the knowledge of it sat on his chest like a stone. Harry came to him 3 days later, contrite and determined in equal measure, and found him grey-faced over a breakfast he had not touched. "Right," Harry said, dropping uninvited into the chair across the scarred oak table. "That was a catastrophe. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. But here's the thing, Malfoy. The problem was the scale. We went enormous. We went skywriting and fireworks and 200 witnesses. And of course it went wrong, because you can't control a thing that big, and Dobby certainly can't. So we go the other way. Small, intimate, controlled. A dinner. Just the two of you, somewhere lovely, candlelight, the lot. And I'll handle the arrangements, so that all you have to do, the only thing in the entire world you have to do, is be there and say 4 words. He spread his hands, as though laying a gift upon the table. Simple, human, no magic involved that a normal person couldn't manage. What could possibly go wrong with a dinner? Draco looked at him for a long moment. "You understand," he said slowly, "that you have just spoken aloud the single most cursed sentence in any language. I'm choosing to ignore your superstition. Where is the elf?" "I've told him to stay home," Harry said firmly. "I've told him this one's just us. No offense to Dobby, but his help nearly got us all sent to Azkaban for arson. So this time we keep it strictly to the 2 species that understand the concept of restraint." He had the grace to look faintly embarrassed even as he said it. He took it well. He cried, obviously, but he took it well. He's promised to keep right out of it. A wiser man, Draco would later reflect, would have heard in that promise the seed of everything that followed. A house elf who has bound the whole of his being to a single act of love does not keep right out of it. He merely waits and watches and chooses his own moment. But Draco was tired and heartsick, and the cold little draught of distance between himself and Hermione had grown unbearable, and so he said yes. He said yes to the dinner. He even, against the whole weight of his foreboding, let himself begin to hope. It was arranged for the Friday following, and a reconciliation of sorts came first. Hermione had returned home by then, stiff and watchful, and Draco had told her a version of the truth that contained no lies but withheld its heart. That he had been there in the alley. Yes, that he'd been planning something foolish that had gone catastrophically wrong. That he was sorry for fleeing. That he had been embarrassed past the point of reason. "What were you planning?" she had asked, her eyes very steady on his face. "Let me make up for it," he had said, which was not an answer, and she had let it pass with the wariness of a woman who has decided to give a man precisely one more chance to be worthy of her patience. "Dinner," he had said. "Friday. Somewhere lovely. Let me try again." And she had studied him a long moment, and then slowly nodded. The restaurant Harry had chosen was a small, enchanted place tucked down a lane in Wizarding Bath, the sort of establishment that did not advertise and could not be found by anyone who did not already know it was there. It occupied the upper floor of what had once been an abbey guest house, and its windows looked out over the floodlit ruin of the old baths. And within, the air was warm and gold and hushed, scented with rosemary and roasting meat, and the beeswax of 100 candles that floated, unsupported, at varying heights throughout the room, casting their soft moving light over the dozen scattered tables. It was, Draco was forced to admit as he handed Hermione up the narrow stair, very nearly perfect. It was exactly the sort of place she loved. She had paused on the threshold and made the small involuntary sound she made when something was lovelier than she had braced for, and Draco's heart had turned over in his chest, and he had thought, perhaps this time. Perhaps Potter is right, and the trick was always to go small. They were shown to a table by the window. The ruin glowed below them, amber against the dark. Hermione's face across the candlelight was open in a way it had not been for a week, the wariness softening, the old warmth coming back into her eyes as she looked at him, and Draco felt the box against his heart and thought that he might, this once, be equal to the moment. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Harry had arranged it all in advance with the proprietor, a discreet and silver-haired witch who had been let in on the secret. At the end of the meal, with the coffee, a particular dessert would be brought to their table and to theirs alone. A delicate construction of spun sugar and dark chocolate, and nested within it, clean and gleaming, the ring. Hermione would discover it. Draco would say his 4 words. There were no fireworks. There was no sky. There was no Dobby. There was only a quiet room, a floating candle, and a question waiting in a bowl of chocolate. And Draco had only to be present when she found it. He should have known. He should have known that Dobby's heart, denied its purpose, would not simply lie down and be quiet. He should have known that an elf who has promised to keep out of a thing has merely promised not to be seen. For while Harry had arranged the dinner with the proprietor, Dobby, who adored Harry Potter and could not bear to be left out of the great work, and who had reasoned, in the boundless and disastrous logic of his love, that he could help in secret, invisibly, where his magic could do no harm, had come to the restaurant that very afternoon. He had found his way into the kitchen, unseen by any living soul, and he had located the special dessert that the silver-haired witch was preparing with such care, and he had understood at once its sacred purpose, and he had wished, with the whole overflowing force of his being, to make it more beautiful still. So he had enchanted it, quietly, lovingly, catastrophically. And then, because an elf cannot tell 2 identical chocolate desserts apart any better than a man can, and because the kitchen, in its Friday evening fury, had by then produced 4 of them for 4 different tables, he had enchanted, to be perfectly safe, all 4. Draco knew none of this. He knew only that the meal was the finest of his life, that Hermione laughed twice in the old unguarded way that undid him, that her hand had found his across the table and stayed there, warm and certain, and that, as the coffee came, he had begun to feel the box over his heart as a promise rather than a dread. He watched the silver-haired proprietor approach with the dessert held before her like a sacrament. He watched her set it down. He saw, deep within the lattice of spun sugar, the cool gleam of pale gold, and his pulse climbed into his throat, and he opened his mouth to begin. And at the table nearest theirs, where a stout and entirely unsuspecting wizard had just been served an identical bowl of chocolate and sugar by a different waiter, the dessert began softly to sing. It sang in a high, sweet, quavering voice, a voice unmistakably Dobby's, a love song of the elf's own composition, and the words it sang were, "O Hermione, O lovely Miss Granger, say yes to the good Master Draco who has changed." And from within the spun sugar there rose, twisting into the candlelight, a glowing apparition of two tiny clasped hands. And the stout wizard recoiled with a yell and knocked his chair backward. And at the third table, the second enchanted dessert burst into a small shower of rose petals over an elderly couple. And at the fourth, the third dessert began, with terrible enthusiasm, to recite poetry, and the entire warm gold hush of the restaurant detonated into chaos, every floating candle guttering wildly in the sudden gusts of competing magic, the proprietor's face draining white, diners leaping up on every side. And Hermione, across the table, with the singing and the petals and the rising poetry all around her, looked down very slowly at the bowl that had just been set before her, at the cool, unmistakable gleam of pale gold nested in the chocolate, and then looked up, equally slowly, at Draco's face, which had gone the colour of old ash, and the comprehension that had begun in the smoke of Diagon Alley finished assembling itself at last behind her eyes. "Draco," she said, very quietly, beneath the singing, in a voice that he could not read at all. "Is that a ring?" He should have said yes. That was the thing he understood with searing clarity in the hours afterward, replaying it in the dark of the spare room where he had retreated like a wounded animal. That the moment had cracked open, against every prediction, into something almost like the chance he had wanted, and that all he had needed to do was meet her eyes across the chaos and say, "Yes, it is a ring. It is your ring. Marry me." And that instead, with the panic roaring in his ears, and the singing dessert mocking him, and 200 strangers' eyes converging, and the box suddenly the heaviest thing he had ever carried, he had done what he had done 7 times before. He had flinched. "It's," he had said, and his voice had failed, and he had reached out and flipped the bowl closed, dragged a napkin over it like a man hiding a body, and said in a strangled rush, "It's nothing. There's been a mistake with the kitchen, the desserts. I'll sort it. And he had risen half out of his chair, gesturing at the proprietor, abandoning the question, abandoning her, retreating once more into the only refuge his cowardice knew, which was to make the unbearable thing small and deny that it had ever been large. And he had watched the warmth go out of Hermione's face. It did not go all at once. That was the part he could not stop seeing. It went the way light goes out of a window when someone within takes the lamp into another room. A slow withdrawal, a closing, the open, unguarded thing she had let him see all evening, folding itself carefully away where he could no longer reach it. She had looked at him with the napkin clenched in his shaking hand, and at the gold he had hidden, and at the elaborate elf magic, singing his secret to a roomful of strangers. And she had understood the whole of it in a single instant. That he had been trying to ask her for weeks in increasingly enormous and disastrous ways, and that even now, even caught, even with the ring an inch from her hand, he had chosen to hide it rather than say the words to her face. She had stood. She had set her own napkin down with terrible gentleness. "Take me home," she had said, and her voice had been quiet and level and worse than any shout could have been. And they had walked out through the wreckage of the singing restaurant in a silence that the floating candles seemed to flinch from, and they had apparated home, and she had gone up the stairs without a word, and the bedroom door had closed, not slammed, closed with a soft final click that was somehow infinitely worse. And Draco had stood alone in the dark kitchen and listened to the rain begin again on the slates, and understood that he had broken something. He went to her the next morning because he could not bear not to. She was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea, still in her dressing gown, her hair down and uncombed, and she did not look up when he came in. The grey light of the rainy morning lay flat across the scarred oak. He stood in the doorway a long moment, the box a hard weight in his pocket. He had carried it down, fool that he was, as though it could help him now. And then he sat across from her in the chair he always sat in, and the small, ordinary domesticity of the gesture made the distance between them feel vaster still. "Hermione! How long?" Her voice was rough, as though she had not slept either. She still did not look up. "How long have you been doing this? Whatever this is. Planning and not telling me. And the alley. That was you. The skull over Diagon Alley that the prophet called a public menace, that the auras are still investigating. That was you. Asking me to marry you. Yes. And last night, the restaurant, the singing." Now she did look up, and her eyes were red-rimmed and bright with something he could not at first name. And then he could. And it was worse than anger. It was hurt, the deep, clean hurt of someone who has been kept on the outside of something that concerned her most of all. All of it. You've been trying to propose to me for weeks, and every single time you've done it through fireworks, and through Harry, and through that poor elf, and through enchanted puddings, and not once. Her voice cracked. She pressed her lips together hard, took a breath, went on, quieter and far more devastating. "Not once have you simply looked at me and said it. You hid it in a bowl, Draco. When I asked you point blank what it was, you put a napkin over it. Do you understand how that felt? To watch you hide it from me?" His knuckles had gone white where his hands were knotted together on the table. He made himself loosen them. He made himself, for once in his cowardly life, not flinch. "Yes," he said. "I understand exactly how it felt. I have understood it since the moment I did it, and I have not slept, and I will likely not sleep again until I have made you understand the why of it, which is not—" His voice was unsteady, and he let it be unsteady, because the time for the smooth Malfoy performance was long past. "Which is not what you think it is. You think I am ashamed of you, or ashamed to be asking. You think there is some part of me that hesitates over the worthiness of it, the match of it, the old filthy arithmetic my family used to do." She had gone very still, and he knew he had named the fear she had not spoken aloud, the one that lived under all the others. "Hermione, look at me. There is no part of me that hesitates over you. You are the single thing in my life I have never once doubted. I would carve out the wall and the mark and the whole rotten history of my name with my own hands if I could buy with it one clean hour of deserving you, and I cannot, and I have made my peace with that, and I want to marry you anyway, because the wanting is bigger than the deserving, and always has been." She was crying now, silently, the tears tracking down without her seeming to notice them, and her hands had tightened around the cold cup. "Then why?" she whispered. "Why couldn't you say it? Why the fireworks? Why the elf? Why anything but the truth?" And here was the moment. Here was the box in his pocket, and her face an arm's length away, and no audience, no smoke, no singing, no Potter, no Dobby, only the rain and the grey light, and the two of them at the old oak table, and the 4 words sat in his throat as they always sat, and he felt the old terror rise, the bone-deep Malfoy horror of the exposed want, of handing her the power to refuse him. And he opened his mouth, and what came out was not the question. What came out was the answer to her question, the true one, the one he had never said aloud to a living soul. "Because if I ask," he said, very low, the words scraping out of some place that had not seen daylight in 28 years, "you might say no, and I have arranged my entire life so as never to ask for anything I am not already certain of receiving, because in the house I grew up in, to want a thing out loud was to be seen wanting it, and to be seen wanting was to be—" He stopped. His jaw worked. Weak. Exposed. A thing to be denied, so that the one who denied you could feel the power of it. I learned that before I learned to read. And I have unlearned nearly all of it, Hermione. I have torn nearly the whole of that house out of myself by the roots. But not that. Not the asking. So I dressed it up. I made it enormous, and I made it someone else's doing, so that if it failed, it would be the fireworks that failed, or the pudding, or Potter, and not— His voice broke clean across the middle. And not me. So that I would never have to stand in front of you with nothing in my hands but the wanting, and hear you say no. The kitchen was utterly silent, but for the rain. Hermione set down her cup. She was looking at him now with an expression that had moved entirely past hurt into something he could not navigate, something raw and enormous, and she opened her mouth. And Draco, terrified suddenly that she was about to answer a question he had not yet had the courage to ask, that she would say the thing he could not survive before he had even managed to risk it, surged to his feet, so fast the chair scraped back across the boards, his hand flying to his pocket, closing on the box, the whole of him for one instant on the very brink of finally dropping to his knee on the kitchen floor and saying the 4 words while the courage was in him. And at that precise moment, with a crack that rattled the window in its frame, Dobby apparated into the centre of the kitchen, tear-streaked and trembling, and clutching an enormous and inexplicable bouquet of what appeared to be live, writhing roses, and wailed, "Dobby has come to fix everything." The roses were the problem as it transpired, though that was only the beginning of the problem. They were not ordinary roses. Dobby, in the depths of his remorse, had spent the night somewhere in the wild reaches of elf magic procuring them, and they were enchanted roses, grown for the singular purpose of declaring love. And they did this by means of a charm that compelled anyone who held them to speak aloud, helplessly and without filter, the truest feeling in their heart. Dobby had intended them as a gift, as the instrument by which the good Master Draco, holding them, would at last be unable to keep his love unspoken. The elf had not entirely thought through what happens when a creature already holding such roses bursts into a kitchen where two people stand frozen on the knife edge of the most fragile conversation of their lives. "Dobby has failed Master Draco," the elf sobbed, and the roses in his arms pulsed, and the charm reached out, and the truth came pouring out of Dobby in a torrent he could no more stop than stop his own tears. Dobby loves the good Master Draco, like Dobby loved Harry Potter, because Master Draco knelt down in the dirty lane and held Dobby's shoulders and told Dobby not to hurt himself. And no master has ever, in all of Dobby's life, knelt down to an elf. And Dobby's heart was so full it broke. And Dobby wanted to give him the most beautiful proposal in the world, because Master Draco gave Dobby the first kindness Dobby ever. "Dobby," Draco started, stricken. But the roses had brushed against Draco's sleeve as the elf staggered forward, and the charm, indiscriminate, took hold of him too, and the words he had spent 28 years caging tore loose all at once, helpless, unstoppable, addressed to the elf, and yet heard by the whole room. "I knelt because you were worth kneeling for, you mad devoted creature. You have loved me more honestly in 3 years than my own father managed in 20, and I could not bear to see you hurt, because I know what it is to be a thing that is punished for loving the wrong way. I know it, and—" His own eyes had gone hot and stinging. He clawed for control and found none, the charm wringing him out like a cloth. "And I cannot stop talking. Why can I not stop talking?" "The roses," Dobby wailed, comprehending his error too late, hurling the writhing bouquet away from himself in horror. But it sailed across the kitchen in a slow, terrible arc and landed, of all the places in the world it could have landed, directly in Hermione's lap, where she sat frozen at the table, and her hands closed around the stems by pure startled reflex. The charm took her instantly. Draco saw it happen. He saw her eyes fly wide, saw her mouth open against her own will, saw the panic of a supremely controlled woman, feeling the deepest contents of her heart dragged toward her lips by a force she could not master. And he understood, in a lurch of horror that eclipsed every horror that had come before, that he was about to hear her truest feelings spoken aloud, here, now, before he had asked, before either of them was ready, the answer arriving ahead of the question in the worst possible way. "Don't," he said. "Hermione, drop them! Don't!" But it was already coming, her voice tight and shaking with the strain of fighting it and losing. "I have been waiting." The words wrenched out of her. Her knuckles were white on the rose stems. "I have been waiting for weeks, you impossible, beautiful, cowardly man. I worked it out after the alley. Do you understand? I am not an idiot. I am the cleverest witch you have ever met, and you thought I hadn't guessed. I knew what the fireworks were. I knew what the dinner was. I have known for a fortnight that you were trying to ask me, and I have been waiting and waiting and waiting for you to stop hiding behind the spectacle and look at me. And she clapped her free hand over her own mouth, but it was useless against the charm. The words kept coming through her fingers, muffled and furious and wet with tears. And I would have said yes the first night. I would have said yes over the cold tea before you ever lit a single firework. I have been aching to say yes, and you keep running. You keep putting napkins over it and apparating away and hiding it inside puddings. And do you have the faintest idea what it does to a person? To know that the man she loves more than her own life wants to marry her and is too frightened of her to ask. The kitchen rang with it. The rain hammered the slates. Dobby had gone utterly still, his great eyes vast with the dawning horror of what his roses had done, both hands pressed over his own mouth now, as though he could somehow contain the catastrophe by stopping his own breath. And Draco stood in the centre of it all, 2 feet from her, with the truth he had been chasing for a fortnight now, flung bleeding open across the kitchen table. She had known. She had always known. She had been waiting. She would have said yes, and felt the entire architecture of his terror collapse silently inward, because the thing he had been most afraid of in all the world, the no, had never even existed. There had never been a chance of it. He had built a fortress against an army that was not coming. He had nearly lost her not to her refusal, but to his own unwillingness to risk hearing a yes he could not believe he deserved. Hermione hurled the roses to the floor at last, breaking the charm's grip, and sat there gasping, her chest heaving, her face streaked and furious and undone, glaring at him through her tears as though daring him to flinch one more time. And here it was. No fireworks, no singing pudding, no sky skull, no enchanted dinner, no plan of Potter's, no scheme at all. Only a rainy kitchen, a weeping elf, a heap of discarded roses on the floorboards, the woman he loved sitting before him, having just confessed against her own will that she had been waiting weeks for him to find his nerve. And the box in his pocket. His hand went to it. And for one suspended instant, the old terror reared up regardless, the lifelong reflex, the voice of the cold house insisting, Don't expose the want. Don't kneel. Don't be seen wanting. And Draco Malfoy stood at the exact dividing line of his entire life, the box half drawn from his pocket, his whole body trembling with the effort of the thing. And he looked at her tear-streaked, furious, beloved face, and he understood that he had run out of spectacles to hide behind, run out of elves and plans and napkins, that there was nothing left between them now but the truth and the 4 words and his own naked nerve. And Dobby, who had been watching all of this with his hands pressed to his mouth, and his enormous heart breaking and mending in the same instant, could not contain himself 1 second longer, and let out a single ringing sob of unbearable hope, and cried. But Draco had already moved. He did not hear the elf. He did not hear the rain, or the kettle, or anything at all. He took the box fully from his pocket, and he sank down, not gracefully, not as he had rehearsed it 40 times in the long mirror, but clumsily, his knee striking the hard boards with a crack he did not feel, and he knelt on the kitchen floor before her, amid the scattered roses, soot still faintly on his cuffs from the restaurant, his hair undone, his eyes streaming and unashamed, and he fumbled the box open with hands that shook so badly he nearly dropped it, and the ring caught the grey rainy light, pale gold, and the cool grey-green stone the colour of her eyes in certain weathers. And he looked up at her, and for the first time in 28 years, Draco Malfoy asked, out loud, with nothing in his hands but the wanting for the thing he was not certain he deserved. Except that he got no further than her name, because the moment the box came open and she saw the ring he had chosen, saw that it was not diamond, not cold, not the flawless Malfoy thing, but warm and particular and unmistakably, achingly her. Hermione made a sound that was half sob and half laugh, and entirely overcome, and she was already sliding off her chair toward him, already reaching for his face with both her hands. Her hands closed around his face, both of them, palms cool against his jaw, her thumbs catching the tears on his cheekbones. And she sank down off the chair until she was kneeling on the boards with him among the discarded roses. The two of them folded together on the kitchen floor in the grey light, and Draco's carefully chosen 4 words were still only 1 word long. "Hermione," he had said, and could not get past it, because she had reached him before the question could, because she was so close now that he could see the wet on her lashes and the precise grey-green of her eyes that he had spent 3 weeks trying to match in a Parisian jeweller's, and the rest of it, "Will you marry me?" sat trembling on his tongue, the words he had failed at 7 times, 8, the words he had built skyfires and singing puddings to avoid, and now there was nothing between him and them at all. "Say it," she whispered. Her thumbs moved against his cheeks. Her voice had gone soft and ragged and unbearably gentle. All the fury of moments ago burned clean away, leaving only this. "Don't you dare run now. Don't you dare put a napkin over it. You're on your knees on our kitchen floor, Draco. There is nowhere left to hide. So say it. Look at me and say it, and stop being afraid of me." And he looked at her. He made himself look at her, fully, the way he had spent his whole life unable to look at the thing he wanted most, without the armor, without the performance, without a single inch of distance left to retreat into. And he found, in the looking, that the terror was simply gone. It had been an army that was not coming. It had been a wall built against an empty field. There was no refusal waiting behind her eyes. There was only her, only Hermione, only the woman who had known for a fortnight, and waited, and ached, and would have said yes over the cold tea, kneeling on the floor with her hands on his face, and her whole heart open to him at last, with nothing held back. "Marry me," he said. The words came out cracked and quiet and entirely without ornament, the plainest thing he had ever said, and they cost him everything and nothing at once. "I have no fireworks. I have no plan. I had a great many of both, and they were each a catastrophe, and I am glad of it, because this is what I should have done 11 days ago over the cold tea, and 7 nights running, and 100 times before that. Just this, just me, asking you with nothing in my hands but the wanting." His voice steadied. His eyes did not leave hers. "I love you past all sense and most of my dignity. I want your name beside mine for the rest of a life I never expected to be allowed to keep. I want to be the man you wait beside until we are old and insufferable, and have forgotten what we ever argued about. Marry me, Hermione. Please. I am asking. At last, I am asking." She did not make him wait. "Yes," she said. And then again, fierce and laughing and crying all at once, her forehead dropping to touch his. "Yes, you idiot. Yes, of course, yes. It was always going to be yes." And then she kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. There was too much in it for gentleness. A fortnight of waiting, and a week of hurt, and 11 days of his cowardice, and years before that of the slow, improbable miracle of the two of them, all of it pouring into the press of her mouth against his. And Draco made a sound low in his chest and dropped the box entirely, let it fall forgotten among the roses, and brought both his hands up to bury them in her loose, unbrushed hair, and pulled her into him as though he meant to make up in a single kiss for every moment of distance he had cowardly authored. She was crying into it, and so, he discovered, was he, and neither of them cared in the slightest. Her hands fisted in the front of his sooty robes. The rain came down on the slates above them. Somewhere very close, a kettle was not shrieking. No spell was misfiring. No audience watched. No plan unravelled. There was only the warm gold ordinary truth of her mouth on his, on the floor of the kitchen that had become their home. And Draco Malfoy, who had spent his whole life certain that wanting a thing out loud would be the end of him, discovered that it was in fact the beginning of everything. When at last they broke apart, they were both breathless and laughing and wet-faced, foreheads still pressed together, her hands still knotted in his robes, and Draco fumbled blindly among the roses for the dropped box, found it, and with hands that had finally stopped shaking, drew out the ring and slid it onto her finger, where it caught the grey light and sat as though it had always belonged there, warm gold against her skin. "It's not diamond," he said, absurdly, because he had to say something, and his throat was too full for anything sensible. "No," she agreed, looking down at it, her voice gone thick. "No, it's—" She turned her hand in the light, and her breath caught. "It's the colour of— Draco, it's the colour of— your eyes," he said. "In certain weathers. I went to Paris. I argued with a jeweller for 3 weeks. I could not bear for it to be cold or flawless or the sort of thing my family would have chosen. I wanted it to look like you. Warm. Particular." His voice dropped. "Worth more than its accounting." She pressed her mouth to his again at that, softer this time, slower, and he felt the new weight of the ring against the back of his neck, where her hand had come to rest, and thought that he had never in his life been so undone or so whole. It was at this moment, this single perfect moment, the two of them kneeling forehead to forehead among the roses with the ring on her finger at last, that the kitchen, which had been holding its breath, exploded. Dobby, who had stood pressed into the corner with both hands over his mouth and his enormous eyes streaming, watching the entire thing unfold with an emotion that had built and built past any vessel that could hold it, finally broke. He let out a wail of pure, incandescent joy that rattled every cup on the dresser and burst into such a torrent of tears that a literal small puddle began to form on the floorboards around his bare feet, and flung himself forward to seize both Draco and Hermione about whatever portions of them he could reach, sobbing. She said yes. The lovely Miss Granger said yes to the good Master Draco who has changed. Dobby knew it. Dobby always knew it. It was the roses, Master Draco. It was Dobby's roses that did it. It was not your roses, you... Draco began, half laughing, but he was cut off because the elf had hugged him hard enough to crack a rib, and Hermione was laughing now too, properly laughing. The great, unguarded laugh that had undone him across 1,000 dinners, gathering the weeping elf into the tangle of the two of them, so that all three were heaped together on the kitchen floor amid the roses and the puddle of joyful tears. And Draco found, to his own astonishment, that he was laughing as hard as either of them, helplessly, the laughter shaking loose something that had been clenched tight in his chest for as long as he could remember. And it was into this absolute heap of two engaged people and one hysterically weeping elf, tangled together on a kitchen floor in a puddle of tears amid a scattering of magically writhing roses, all three of them laughing and crying at once, that Harry Potter, who had received a frantic and entirely incomprehensible owl from Dobby some 20 minutes prior, reading only "Come at once the roses," and had apparated over, braced for catastrophe, with his wand already drawn, and his aura's instincts screaming, flung open the kitchen door, took in the scene before him with wide and uncomprehending eyes, and froze entirely on the threshold, with the rain streaming off his coat and his wand still raised against a disaster that had, for once in this entire doomed enterprise, refused to occur. For a long moment, Harry simply stood there, wand half raised, rain dripping from the hem of his coat onto the kitchen floor, his eyes travelling slowly over the impossible tableau before him. Draco Malfoy and Hermione Granger heaped together on the floorboards, a sobbing house elf draped across the both of them, a scattering of writhing roses, a small puddle of what appeared to be tears, and on every face an expression of such helpless, overwhelmed joy that it took his aura-trained mind several full seconds to accept that no one was, in fact, dying. "What," he said carefully, lowering the wand by degrees, "in the name of all that is holy, has happened in this kitchen?" It was Hermione who answered. She lifted her head from the tangle, her face streaked and glowing, and held up her left hand so that the ring caught the grey light, and said, in a voice that wobbled and then steadied into something radiant, "He asked me. He finally, Harry, he asked me, properly, on his knees. With no fireworks and no pudding and nothing, just him. And I said, yes." Harry's face did something complicated. The wariness, the alarm, the aura's braced suspicion, all of it cracked and fell away at once. And what came up underneath was a grin so wide and so genuine that it took years off him, and he sagged back against the doorframe and let out a long breath of pure relief. "He asked you," he repeated. "He actually managed it. Without..." He gestured vaguely at the air, encompassing the entire 2-week catalogue of catastrophe. "Without any of it." "With all of it ruined first," Draco said dryly, disentangling himself from the elf with as much dignity as a man can muster while sitting in a puddle on his own kitchen floor. "Make no mistake, Potter. Every single thing you and this creature arranged was an unmitigated disaster. The sky skull, the singing pudding. The fact that the prophet is, as we speak, running a front-page investigation into a suspected dark revival over Diagon Alley, because your elf cannot govern his own enchantments. The roses, which compelled me to confess my feelings to a house elf against my will, and which then nearly extracted my fiancé's answer before I had managed to pose the question. All of it, a catalogue of unbroken catastrophe from beginning to end. He paused. He looked at Hermione, who was still kneeling beside him with the ring on her finger and the most absurdly happy expression he had ever seen on a human face. And something in his own face softened past all his attempts to keep it stern. And in the end, none of it mattered, because the only thing that worked was the one thing none of you had anything to do with, which was me, on the floor, saying 4 words. 3 words, Hermione corrected, leaning into his shoulder. You said, marry me. That's 2. And then a great many other words after, most of them lovely. I am attempting to be poetic, Granger. Do not audit me. She laughed and kissed his jaw, and Harry, from the doorway, made a sound that was somewhere between a groan and a laugh, and crossed the kitchen to haul Draco bodily up off the floor by the forearm. A gesture so casual, so devoid of the old enmity, that Draco found himself accepting the hand without thinking, and the 2 of them stood there a moment, soot-stained and rain-damp, and grinning helplessly at one another. 2 men who had spent half their lives as each other's certainties, and had somehow, across a fortnight of shared catastrophe, become something neither of them would yet say aloud. You know, Harry said, when you wrote to me that day, fine, 4:30, why, I genuinely thought you were going to ask me for money, or to help you cover up a crime. I never, in 1,000 years, imagined that I would humiliate myself this thoroughly in pursuit of a wedding, that you'd come to me. Harry's voice had gone quieter, and the grin had gentled into something more careful. Of everyone, you came to me, and I spent the whole fortnight waiting for you to remember that you hated me, and you never did. You just... He shrugged, awkward with it, the way men are awkward with the things that matter most. You let me help, even when the help was rubbish, even when my brilliant restaurant plan ended with a man screaming at a pudding. You didn't throw it in my face. Draco regarded him for a moment. Then, with the air of a man making an enormous and grudging concession, he said, You were less intolerable than I anticipated, Potter. I may, in a moment of severe weakness, find myself asking you to stand up at the wedding. Harry's eyebrows shot up. As your best man? As a best man. I make no promises as to seniority. The position may be shared. Draco's mouth twitched. With present company. And here he turned, deliberately, to the elf. Dobby had pulled himself together by slow degrees, though his eyes were still streaming and his small chest still heaving with the aftershocks of a joy too vast for his frame, and he stood now wringing his hands in the hem of his striped jumper, looking up at the 3 of them with an expression of such anxious, hopeful devotion that Draco felt something in his chest contract. The elf had ruined everything. The elf had nearly ended the whole enterprise a dozen times over, had set fire to Diagon Alley, had compelled Draco to weep openly about his feelings, had spent the night procuring roses from the wild edges of the world for no reason but love. And the elf had also, Draco saw this now with sudden and uncomfortable clarity, been the only one among them who had never once doubted that it would happen, who had loved the project with his whole heart precisely because he loved them with his whole heart, whose every catastrophe had been, in its way, an act of pure devotion. Draco crouched down again, for the second time in a fortnight, on the floor in front of this small, ridiculous creature, and took both of Dobby's hands in his. "Dobby," he said, "listen to me." The elf's lower lip trembled. "Master Draco is angry. Dobby ruined everything, the roses and the pudding and the sky. Dobby always loves too much, and it always—" "You did ruin everything," Draco agreed gravely. "Every single thing. You are, without exception, the most catastrophically unhelpful helper in the recorded history of the wizarding world, and I say that as a man who has reviewed considerable competition." He paused, and his voice changed, dropped, went rough at the edges in the way it did only when he had stopped performing. "And you are also the reason I am engaged. Not because of the roses, not because of the roses, no matter what you tell the wedding guests, but because you loved me, you mad creature, loudly and without sense and without ceasing. From the day I knelt in that lane, and somewhere in the wreckage of all your disasters, I learned that being loved that openly does not destroy a person. It is the only thing that ever made the asking possible." His own throat had thickened. He pressed on regardless. "So, I would be honored, genuinely and without irony, which you will note is rare for me. I would be honored if you would stand with us, at the wedding, not as a servant, as family, if you will have a place among such a collection of fools." For a moment, Dobby did not move at all. His enormous eyes filled past their capacity. His mouth worked silently. And then he made a sound, a single, high, broken sound of joy so pure it was almost painful to hear, and flung himself forward into Draco's arms with such force that he knocked the man clean backward onto the floorboards again and buried his face in Draco's sooty robes, and wept as though his heart would burst, sobbing something incoherent in which the only distinguishable words were family, and the good Master Draco and Dobby will iron nothing. Dobby promises. Dobby is so happy. And Draco, flat on his back on his own kitchen floor for the third time that morning, with an ecstatic house elf sobbing as to his chest and his fiancée laughing helplessly above him, and Harry Potter actually wiping his eyes by the door, began against every instinct his cold, proud upbringing had ever instilled in him to laugh, really laugh. The kind of laughter that comes from somewhere deep and long-locked, that shakes loose decades of held breath, that a man laughs only when he has finally understood that he is safe and loved and home. Hermione lowered herself to sit on the floor beside the two of them, one hand resting on Draco's chest beside the elf's head, the ring on her finger catching the light, and looked down at the man she was going to marry, undone, soot-streaked, laughing, with a house elf weeping joyfully into his robes. And the look on her face was the look she had worn that very first night over the cold tea, the open, unguarded thing she had folded away after the restaurant, returned now and brighter than before. "You're going to tell people the roses did it," she said, "aren't you, for the rest of our lives?" "Granger," Draco managed between gasps of laughter, "I am going to tell our grandchildren the roses did it." Outside, the rain had begun at last to ease. The wedding came in the late spring, in the gardens behind the small house near Hogsmeade, on a day so clear and gold that even Draco, who had spent the entire morning convinced with the unshakable pessimism of a man who had watched two grand gestures detonate, that some catastrophe must surely be lying in wait, could find nothing in the sky to fear. He had wanted it small, so had she. After the sky skull and the singing pudding, and the prophet's breathless month-long investigation into a dark revival that had turned out to be one over-enthusiastic house elf, the two of them had developed a powerful and shared aversion to spectacle. And so the guest list was short, and the arrangements were plain, and the whole affair was held out of doors beneath an old apple tree that had come into blossom precisely on schedule, its branches heavy with white, the petals loosening now and then in the warm air to drift down over the gathered chairs like a snow that did not chill. Draco stood beneath the tree in robes of deep grey, not black. He had refused black, had refused anything that recalled the colours of the house he had spent his life clawing free of, and waited, and his hands, he noted with quiet astonishment, were perfectly steady. There was no terror in him this time. There was no box weighing against his heart, no question caged in his throat, no spectacle to hide behind, and no spectacle to fear. The asking was done. The worst thing he had ever made himself do, he had already done, on a kitchen floor amid a heap of roses, and having survived it, he found he was afraid of nothing else the day could bring. At his shoulder stood his two best men. This had been the source of considerable negotiation. Harry Potter, in dress robes that he had plainly been forced into and kept tugging at the collar of, stood on Draco's right with the slightly stunned expression of a man who still could not entirely believe the turn his life had taken. That he was standing up at the wedding of Draco Malfoy, that he had spent a fortnight conspiring in the man's romance, that the boy he had loathed across 1,000 school corridors had become, through some alchemy neither of them had words for, a friend. And on Draco's left, upon a small raised stool that had been conjured specially so that he might be seen, stood Dobby. The elf was magnificent. He had been outfitted for the occasion in robes of his own. Hermione had insisted, had taken him herself to be measured, had refused every protest, and they were the finest garments Dobby had ever in his life possessed. A deep wedding grey to match the groom's, tailored to his small frame, and he wore them with such trembling, reverent pride that he had not stopped crying since dawn. He had appointed himself, additionally and without anyone's authorization, the keeper of the rings, and clutched the small cushion that bore them with a white-knuckled intensity that suggested he would defend it to the death, and had been heard several times throughout the morning, muttering fierce reassurances to himself that Dobby will not drop them, Dobby will not enchant them, Dobby will only hold them. Holding is safe. Dobby can hold. And then the small assembly rose and turned, and Hermione came out of the house and down through the garden toward him. She wore no veil. Her hair was loose, the way he loved it best, with a few sprigs of the apple blossom tucked into it, and her dress was simple and pale and entirely without ornament, and she carried no bouquet. They had agreed, with feeling, that there would be no roses of any kind within a mile of the ceremony. And she walked toward him through the drifting petals with the late spring light all around her, and her grey-green eyes fixed on his face. And Draco, who had spent his whole life learning to look at the thing he wanted most without letting it show, stood beneath the apple tree and let it show. Let all of it show. The whole undefended truth of what he felt, written plain across his face for everyone gathered to see, with no armor and no distance and no performance, because he had learned at last that being seen to want a thing was not the end of a man, but the beginning of him. She reached him. She took his hands. They were both, he noted, trembling slightly now, but together, in the same rhythm, the small shared tremor of two people standing at the edge of the rest of their lives. The words of the ceremony washed over him half heard. He was aware of the officiant's voice, of the warm air, of the petals coming down, of Harry beside him breathing carefully, and Dobby beside him weeping in small ecstatic hiccups into the ring cushion. But mostly he was aware of her hands in his and her eyes on his face, and the impossible fact of her, here, choosing him, after everything, in full knowledge of everything. When the moment came for the rings, Dobby rose to the very tips of his toes upon his stool and presented the cushion with both shaking hands and an expression of such fierce concentration that a ripple of fond laughter moved through the small gathering. And the elf did not drop them, and the elf did not enchant them, and the elf managed the entire transaction without a single catastrophe. And when it was done, he sank back onto his heels and burst into fresh tears of triumph and relief, so violent that Harry had to steady him with a hand on his small shoulder to keep him from toppling off the stool entirely. And then there were the vows. Draco had written his and discarded them 4 times. He had wanted them perfect. He had wanted them grand. And in the end, standing beneath the apple tree with her hands in his, he abandoned the parchment entirely and said the only thing that was true. "I spent the whole of my life," he said, his voice low and clear in the spring quiet, "afraid to ask for anything I was not certain of receiving. I built an entire person out of that fear. And then I met you, and I wanted you past all certainty, past all sense, past anything I had ever let myself want before. And for a long time the wanting only made the fear worse, because there was so much more to lose. It took me a fortnight of catastrophes and a kitchen floor full of roses to understand the thing you had known all along, that you cannot earn your way into being loved, and you cannot arrange it, and you cannot stage it, and you certainly cannot hire a house elf to fireworks it across the sky. A wave of laughter, watery and warm. You can only stand in front of the person with nothing in your hands but the wanting, and ask. So I am going to spend the rest of my life asking. For your hand at breakfast, and your opinion on everything, and your patience with my worst days, and your name beside mine, until we are old and insufferable, and have forgotten what we ever argued about. I am not afraid of the asking any more. You taught me that. You taught me that being seen to want you is not weakness. It is the bravest and best thing I have ever done." His voice nearly broke. He held it. "I love you, Hermione Granger. Out loud, in front of everyone, with nothing to hide behind. And I always will." She was crying, and so was half the garden, and Dobby had become entirely incoherent. And when Hermione spoke her own vows, her voice shook so badly that she had to stop twice and press her lips together and begin again. And what she said in the end was that she had loved him before. She had understood that she loved him, that she had spent the fortnight of his catastrophes torn between exasperation and the most tender ache she had ever known, that she had wanted to shake him and to hold him in roughly equal measure, and that she would not have traded a single disaster of it. Not the sky skull, not the singing pudding, not the morning he had wept into an elf's roses on their kitchen floor, because each one had been, in its ridiculous way, the sound of a frightened man learning to be brave enough to love her in the open. And then the officiant spoke the words that bound them, and there was a pause, the held breath of the whole bright garden. And Draco drew her in, both hands coming up to frame her face the way hers had framed his on the kitchen floor, and he kissed her. It was not like that first frantic kiss among the roses. This was slow and certain and unhurried, the kiss of a man who had finally stopped running, who had nowhere left he would rather be, and nothing left to be afraid of. Her mouth warm against his in the spring light, the apple blossom drifting down around them both, her hands fisting gently in the front of his grey robes, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw, the whole of the watching garden and the warm gold day and the rest of their lives folding away into nothing but this. The two of them beneath the tree in the open, seen by everyone, hiding from no one. The garden erupted. Somewhere Harry was cheering, and somewhere the small assembly was on its feet, and directly beside them Dobby let out a wail of joy, so enormous and so unrestrained that it startled a flurry of fresh blossom loose from the apple tree, which came down over the newly married pair in a soft white drift. And this time, blessedly, miraculously, it was only blossom, and not fire, and not a skull, and not a singing pudding, but simply the spring itself, letting go of its petals over the two of them, as though the world had decided, for once, to help and managed not to ruin it. When at last they broke apart, they were both laughing, foreheads pressed together, breathless, and Draco looked into the grey-green eyes that he had crossed Paris to match in a ring, and found in them everything he had spent his whole life too afraid to ask for, freely given, and his for the keeping. "I told you the roses did it," he murmured, and she laughed and kissed him once more, lightly, and the petals came down, and the long catastrophe of the most unique marriage proposal in the history of the wizarding world ended, at last, exactly as it should have. With the asking done, the fear behind them, and nothing left between them but the open, ordinary, extraordinary truth of two people who had finally and forever found their way home.
So that's the end of our story. Thank you for staying with me. I wanted to write something a little different this time. Not a dark story, not a sad one, just a story about a man who loved someone and was scared to ask. I think we all know that feeling. We want something so much, and the waiting makes us afraid. So we hide, we make excuse, we wait for the perfect moment that never comes. That was the Draco does here. He has the ring for 11 days. He counts the days every morning, but he just can't say 4 small words. My favorite part to write was the kitchen. No fireworks, no big plan, just two people on the floor crying and laughing at the same time. and one elf making everything worse and somehow better. I love it writing Dobby most of all. He ruins everything, but he ruins it with love, and in the end, that love is the thing that saves them. So here is what I hope you take away. You don't have to be perfect to be loved. You don't need fireworks. You just have to be brave enough to ask. Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart and don't wait 11 days. I'll see you in the next story.